Okay, welcome everybody. It is the top of the hour, so it's time to get started with our monthly webinars. For those that don't know me, my name's Dr. Jackie Jacob, and I am the Poultry Extension Coordinator here at the University of Kentucky. As part of my job, I coordinate the community of practice for small and backyard flocks on e-extension. E-extension is the electronic version of the United States Cooperative Extension Service. And we do have quite a page and website and Facebook page dedicated for small and backyard flocks. As part of that program, we do these monthly webinars. This month's webinar is Ray Smith, who is at University of Kentucky as well, on grazing multi-species on the pastures, including poultry. So to get maximum use of the pasture, you use it for more than one species. So for those that are doing it or considering it, Ray will be talking about that. While he is giving his presentation, I will be on mute. If at any time you think of a question you'd like to ask, you can either type it in the chat box or type it in the Q&A box, and I will be monitoring the questions. If the question is a clarification of what Dr. Smith is talking about at the time, I will pop up and interrupt him for the clarification. If not, it will wait until the end of the presentation so that we can have a period of Q&A on the topic. So it's all yours, Ray. If you'd like to share your screen, I will go on mute.
Great. It's good to be with folks today. And as Jackie said, I'll talk about pasture grazing with multiple species. Now, this is one multiple species pasture, but I'm not really talking about saving money on structures for goats to get on by using your cattle. That's not what I'm talking about. Plus, I don't really want to encourage you to graze to dirt. Not really talking about a way to keep your grandkids out of trouble by keeping them in the enclosure. And I'm not really talking about a method I used in Virginia to help keep graduate students working hard by keeping them in an enclosure. All jesting aside, the main focus I want to talk about is grazing or pastured poultry and the benefit, the management of that, but also the benefits of adding other animal species. And as Jackie said, I want to encourage you with any questions that you might have. I want to take plenty of time at the end because I'm sure that I will cover some of the things that you might have questions about. So I just looked at multi-species grazing and pastured poultry and several things. So for example, this large operation, White Oak Pastures, in South Georgia, they're grazing 10 different species of livestock, and they talked about the benefits. Before I get into the meat of my presentation, I wanted to mention, for those of you in Kentucky and surrounding states, and may even be of interest to you, wherever you're at, we have our Kentucky Forage website. And just Google KY Forages, you get to the website. One of the most popular features of this is the KY Forages YouTube channel. All of the presentations that we give for our statewide and even regional conferences, we record those. So it's a great way to go back and listen to resources and things like our fall grazing school or other things. You can subscribe to Forage News here or see upcoming events. But I'm mainly talking about this because I'm going to show you a publication right here that's pastured poultry that Jackie and Dr. Pastured and I wrote. You simply go to that website, look under grazing, that's the category it fits in, and get to that pastured poultry publication. Now, the main emphasis I want to make, and a fair bit of the emphasis we have on pastured poultry, is good pasture management. So my expertise as foragers and a forage specialist. So I'm going to talk a lot about the benefits of managing your pastures with whatever species that you're using. And this is actually, I'm showing this as a bad example. Feeding in one spot, turning that into mud, overgrazing around that. Probably the other in the pasture is undergraze. Another example of this looks like a nice pasture, good cover, nice flowers. But this is a species, the main species you see, the yellow flower species is buttercup, a species that not only is unpalatable, not grazed, but has some toxicity. That's from overgrazing. So good pasture management is what we have here from Todd Farm. Todd operates a fairly large farm or several different farm units in the Lexington, Kentucky area. And I'm highlighting Todd for a couple of reasons. One, I talked with him a good bit over the years.
Ray,
He started.
people
Yes.
are having a hard time with your audio.
Let me take this out and see if this is better. Jackie, is it better like that?
Yeah, that's better, I think.
Okay.
Is that better, Caroline? She says, thank you. Okay.
Okay, that's great. I'll not use that microphone again. So Todd Clark started farming actually late high school with tobacco and custom work. But as the years progressed, Todd was looking at opportunities, not only to make money, but also that would be sustainable for his operation. So he got in over the years with hay production, custom hay production, then into beef cattle production, and then into pastured poultry, sheep, not goats right now. But I talked to Todd a lot about how he integrates the poultry, and in his case, chickens, both layers and meat birds, into his whole operation, particularly in how he integrates that in with his cattle. At one time, Todd was going through about 30,000 meat birds a year, 7,000 at a time. So he has a fair bit of background in this. This is his Facebook page there, Clark Family Farm. Okay, I mentioned to you that one of the main focuses I want to talk about is the importance of pasture management, whatever species you're grazing. And I found both with myself, with birds in our backyard, and with people that are on a much larger scale with pastured poultry, that they often tend to maybe overthink what they're doing, trying to find the perfect plant that'll give the most nutritional benefit, and sometimes forget the value of good pasture management. Now, before I go further, I want to highlight fertilizer prices. Now, it's for two reasons. One, there's a huge benefit of the manure that comes down from the litter that you have with poultry on a pasture, but also with cattle. Fertilizer prices in the US and actually around the world, for those of you out of the country, have doubled and tripled in the last year, even in the last 6 months. So very difficult to apply the nutrients needed for pasture growth through inputs, fertilizer inputs. So I want to encourage you before, as you move into this coming growing season, to soil sample your pastures. Now you may say, well, I'm not going to do that. I can't afford fertilizer, but it gives you a lot more information than just whether you need to buy fertilizer or not. When you soil test, you find out the pH, you find out the phosphorus and the potash levels. Typically, often we don't get the nitrogen levels because that's more mobile in the system, but we get those nutrients like the phosphorus and potash and what's needed. So why would you soil sample if you say it's too expensive or you're not going to apply chemical fertilizer? That soil analysis is going to form the basis for your forage management. Whether you add fertilizer, whether you focus your animals, whether they're your cattle or your goats or your sheep or your chickens, on a certain area to build up the nutrients. So here's an example. This is an actual pasture in Kentucky, and don't look so much at the exact level because those vary from state to state, but look at the level of adequacy. Take a close-up of one of our actual reports. We're in the high level for the phosphorus and potassium. The pH is, the pH there in the middle is 6.5. That's very adequate. So in this case, there would be nothing needed for that pasture. Here's another one. This is actually a hayfield where nutrients have been removed in successive years through the hay production. The levels are low to very low. Not only would this be a candidate for potentially chemical fertilizer, but this field could be an excellent candidate to increase the level of nutrients through maybe with cattle feeding hay in that pasture with the cattle. It's an excellent candidate for using chicken tractors on that field to increase the nutrient level and increase the forage growth. With fertilizer prices as high as they are, a very important aspect in pasture management is incorporating legumes. They fix nitrogen from the air. In fact, you're going to get, many of you know this already, but it doesn't hurt to emphasize, 50 to over 200 pounds per acre per year of nitrogen that would be available through successive plants from legumes, depending on the amount that you have in the pasture and which species you choose. That's going to increase the yield and the quality. That's going to increase animal performance. It's going to improve, in most cases, summer growth. Many of the legumes have better summer growth than many of our cool season forages. And for those of us in certain areas in the US that have tall fescue, there's some toxicity involved with a fungal endophyte that can help dilute that. So I said the soil test, that's going to give you a lot of information. Add legumes, you get the nitrogen there for free. So I mentioned that one of my main focuses is pasture management. If I was in an audience and I asked the question, what do pastures need for regrowth? I would ask a raise of hands, but they need energy for regrowth. And that energy comes from the leaf area remaining for photosynthesis, and it comes from the stored carbohydrates in the stem bases of grasses and in roots of legumes. Now, why am I going into this bit of physiology? Because this is very important for grazing management with whatever livestock species that you're using. So let me just show you that by way of example of what I mean by the importance of maintaining leaf area and giving a rest period. We'll talk about that in a moment with rotational grazing. So this is a simple example where we had 2 pots in the greenhouse of orchard grass, and they had been maintained under ideal conditions for 6 months. Then the one on the left, we clipped it back to 1 inch once a week for a month. So in essence, we were simulating continuous grazing. The one on the right, we clipped to 3.5 inches at the beginning of the month and at the end of the month to simulate rotational grazing. And I'm going to show you the regrowth that occurred in a 6-day period of time. Okay, here's at day 3, day 4, and day 6. Obviously, you can see a tremendous benefit in the speed of regrowth, in the volume of forage, where the plant was not cut as close, simulating one that's not grazed as close, and not as frequent. So there's a huge benefit in not grazing close, not overgrazing maybe with poultry or leaving them too long in an area so they take it down close, or with cattle grazing too close and giving a rest period. Okay, here's another example of 2 actual plugs of soil with grass taken from a pasture. The one on the left was rested all winter long. You see there that there's really not any active growth. This is just the residue over the winter. And the one on the right had been grazed all winter long. This is the amount of regrowth in a period of 9 days. So even even during a period of not active growth, leaving the base of that plant. I mentioned that carbohydrates and grasses are stored in the base of the stems. Leaving that base of the plant allows much quicker regrowth coming into the spring. Same thing would happen between grazings. So again, avoiding overgrazing, providing a rest period, whether it's during the growing season, whether it's over winter, can make a tremendous difference. So when I talked to Todd about how he manages those animals out on his pastures, when he's managing his meat birds, and Todd talked about several things that I had not even thought about. I mean, he definitely said that he moves regularly. In his case, he moves each day. He has about 81 square feet under the hoops that he uses, typically about 50 birds under each. He's moving daily. He's moving daily for a couple of reasons. He's moving daily so he doesn't overstress that particular area. It gives good nutrients, but does it, you might say, overgraze. Another point that Todd made that was very interesting, and we have the example in the bottom photo here from our Pasture Poultry publication, that the forage was quite tall. Todd said that with the using poultry in grazing, that they do better, or he's found they do better when there's not a lot of tall growth that the cages are going on top of. And in the bottom frame here, this is an example of where the birds have been there for too long a period of time. So there's very little growth and very little vegetation. It's going to take much longer to come back. Okay, so rotational grazing. Many of you are familiar with that. If you're pastured poultry and you're moving a cage, or you're moving your laying hens from area to area, that's going to be your rotational grazing. But I spend a lot of my time talking about rotational grazing with beef cattle, with other ruminants like sheep and goats. In rotational grazing, in its simplest form, is just subdividing a large pasture into smaller paddocks so that there can be a rest period. So we can have that rapid regrowth like we saw with the orchard grass example. But one of the things that I've talked a lot more about in the last few years is the advantage of rotational grazing to avoid overaccumulation of nutrients around the water source, around maybe the trees where they're going under the shade. So having water in the pasture available to different paddocks and having the ability to move the animals between paddocks can make a tremendous difference. So then rotational grazing with poultry would typically be with what we might call a chicken tractor or other type of enclosure. That's the rotational grazing. You're actually moving from place to place. A comment that Todd made is that he has much greater benefits in not going back on the same area in a given season. So he can have about 700 birds on an acre of land during a season by moving daily and never going back to the same location. And he's not going back to the same location, partly because he wants to get the greatest benefit of the manure onto the land or the poultry litter. And he also wants to have the best regrowth of the forage. And Todd has found that his beef cattle production doesn't change, isn't hindered by adding the chickens. In fact, the added nutrients from the chickens is typically improving his pasture growth, improving his beef cattle production. So he's getting, with that multi-species system that he's using, a win-win, extra benefit. Now, we have people from all over the US and in at least one other country. And so there's all kind of forage species that are there. So I want to encourage you to think about the forage species that you have and manage according to how those grow. So a forage species like bluegrass on the left of the screen has a low growth, height, or the leaves are growing close to the ground. So that can be grazed or more frequently and closer to the ground. Orchard grass is a more upright growing grass. There's a number of upright growing grasses. Those of you in the Midwest, it may be a native grass that cannot be grazed as close, or if it is, it's not going to grow back as fast. Tall fescue's in the middle. Participant from Florida would probably have Bermuda grass would be one of the main grasses. It can be grazed closer because it keeps leaf area close to the ground. Plus it has the rhizomes and stolons that are below or right at the soil surface. So manage the grazing based on the species, based on the forage species that you have. With legumes, a low growing legume like white clover, the leaves are close to the ground. The main stems are actually stolons that grow along the top of the ground. That can be grazed closer and more frequently. Where taprooted legumes like red clover and alfalfa, they're storing their carbohydrates for regrowth in the roots. So the grazing should not be as frequent. They need plenty of time to grow back and replenish those carbohydrates in the root systems to be able to grow back the next time. I'm not going to take a lot of time with the individual species, but I want to make a few comments as I go through a few photographs. We have on that Kentucky Forage's website, a forage identification and use guide under species. So you can get these images, but more importantly, information about each of the species and how it can be adapted in a grazing system. So alfalfa works very well for hay and for ruminant grazing, not as well for poultry because of its upright growth and the fact that it does need a long rest period. Red clover, another taprooted legume, has a lot of benefits in a pasture system. Again, it needs a longer regrowth period. So when I say longer, I'm talking about something like a month. Whereas white clover fits very well into grazing or pastured poultry because it can be grazed close and still have good growth. With the grasses, I kind of alluded to this in that image I showed earlier. Kentucky bluegrass maintains leaf area close to the ground, so it can handle more frequent and closer grazing, whatever species you're using. Bermuda grass is another one that can be grazed close to the ground, whereas orchard grass is a taller growing grass. Tall fescue, as I mentioned, is in between, and there's two ryegrasses. Annual ryegrass that would be planted in the fall of the year, used for spring and early summer grazing, and perennial ryegrass. Now in Kentucky, we typically talk about perennial ryegrass only survives about 2 years. So we don't encourage planting of that for long-term pastures. We talk about it more for short-term pastures. For those of you in the upper Midwest, in Maine, and even Scotland, then perennial ryegrass would be a very useful forage because it can be grazed close. It does have good regrowth. It establishes very easily. So short-term type for maybe overgrazed pastures with a spring seeding or a fall seeding in Kentucky and surrounding states, longer term in other areas of the country. Now, I want to show this last grass for two reasons. For those of you not familiar with crabgrass, most of us consider it a weed. It's a summer annual grass that grows really thick, especially in a garden situation. But when I'm talking about what's a good pasture for multiple species, crabgrass is actually a very nutritious grass. So even though in certain situations you consider it a weed, it's a grass that can be very helpful. In fact, we're even encouraging people, if they want a high quality summer grass, to consider planting it because you can buy varieties of crabgrass. So before you dismiss a certain forage as that's not good because it's a weed in one situation, think about how it may fit in your situation. Now, I want to encourage all of you, wherever you're at, to make sure that you're choosing varieties of forages when you are planting that are adapted to your area. In Kentucky, we have a number of variety tests, but probably the most useful one And this would fit also in states that are joining Kentucky, this long-term summary. You'll notice that we have a huge range of species that we're testing for how they grow as far as their yield. We also have tests there on the bottom tables of how they're adapted to grazing. So for example, white clover, if you want to say, I want a white clover that's going to have good production, but also survive well under grazing, then you can look at the varieties that do well in both of those tests. Now, I want to make several points about establishment. People are often asking me, what's the best pasture to have, whether you're talking cattle or small ruminants or poultry. And I spent a lot of time a few years ago trying to come up with the very best mixture for pastured poultry, and realized that the best pasture, the best mix of species that gives the best longevity and quality fits whether you're talking about poultry or cattle or small ruminants. So I've got an example here of a publication that we have that gives the seeding rate and the timing to seed. But this obviously, you'd want to find the one that fits within your state or your country. But seeding depth, if you're going to be overseeding, is critical. This example here shows that 1/4 to 1/2 inch is the ideal depth for almost all of our perennial grasses, whether they're cool season or warm season. Deeper depths that are easy to get with much of our seeding equipment, you're really wasting your money on seed. Now, this is a very old photograph. I wanted to show it now because frost seeding is something that if you put seed on top of the ground in a pasture that doesn't have a lot of residue, so the seed actually hits the soil, it's a very easy way to get especially clover established. Part of using this old photograph is there's not really any new technique. You're just scattering seed on top of the ground. In small areas, people would even do this by hand. Larger areas, just a broadcast seeder like this. And the simple way to, you're spreading the seed out. The important thing is that you're putting it out late winter. You're trying not to have a lot of plant residue if you're frost seeding. You're getting the seed buried that 1/4 inch deep because of the freeze thaw cycles. I spent a number of years at University of Manitoba in Canada. This works whether you're in Canada, in areas in Scotland where there's good frost, or any place in the US. Only area that probably would not work for those of you listening would be Florida, because you do need freeze thaw cycles. Use high quality seed, use the correct seeding rate, get good even seed distribution. Simplest way to overseed is this frost seeding, and these are what we talk about in Kentucky. Frost seeding in February. If you're waiting until March, then using a drill. Now, if you're in Alaska, then the frost seeding may be in late March. The important thing is that you've still got 4 to 6 weeks of potential freezing at night. Not every night, but some nights you have potential freezing at night to so that you have that frost heaving action. Direct or no-till seeding is an excellent way to get forages into pastures.
Ray, there was a question, why late winter versus late fall for your frost thing?
So you need that 4 to 6 weeks of frost action. So late winter works well. Late fall, like for example, in areas of the country where the ground is frozen all winter long, that is potential. So maybe someone in Alaska might put seed on the ground because they know the ground's going to be frozen all winter long. That seed's going to germinate the following spring. We typically don't recommend that as we move in much of the US, because if you go in November and the soil still has some warmth to it, even though you're getting freezing at night, and you get a warm day, you may have the seed germinate and then it's going to die. So going in the late winter, you know the soil is cold, even if it's not freezing all the time. So that gives the best chance of the seed it being incorporated before it starts germinating.
Great, thanks.
So any other time of the year that you're seeding, in most of our forages are cool season forages. The fall is the time to plant. So the clovers work well with frost seeding. Grasses do not work as well with frost seeding. They're not incorporated as well because they're kind of light and fluffy. But any forage seed, you can use this kind of direct seeding or no-till seeding. If you were seeding a warm season forage like Bermuda grass in Florida, then you'd be seeding that in the summer. But our cool season forages in the fall of the year. Again, a couple of months before you get into frost, into below freezing temperatures. So early September for Kentucky. And the key with no-till seeding is just making sure that you get the seed covered, but not too deep. So actually seeing a few seed on top of the soil, as you can see in this photograph, means that probably the rest of the seed is just barely under the soil. And then if you're not just overseeding, you're actually starting from scratch, then doing a prepared seed bed is what a number of producers do. But this is saved more for probably hay stands. Majority of people with pasture have land that has some slope to it. And so using a tilling the seed bed can lead to erosion. If you're a small operation, you're not able to have equipment, then even just a drag over the field, loosening up the soil, or a light disking, and then broadcast seeding, and then rolling over the top of it with some type of roller like this or a drag can be a way to incorporate seed. Typically, we'd recommend a higher seeding rate in that case because you're not as using as good a precision seeding. So I'm ending showing you again this forage website. Both it may be useful for you to look at. I mentioned that we've got a number of presentations over the last 5 to 6 years at the KY Forages YouTube channel. You see a link there in the upper right corner, but also I'm just encouraging you to look for information that fits in your area. Now, I tried to leave plenty of time for questions because I know there may be some more with the practical way of how you're going to incorporate multi-species into your forage system. My emphasis was good pasture management, but be glad to answer any questions that you might have.
Bob asks, can we discuss the impacts of different digestive systems, birds versus ruminants versus non-ruminants on pasture use, longevity, consumption, etc.?
Okay, let me attempt that, and then I feel free for others to throw in, or Bob, for you to follow up the question. So I don't think as much about digestive systems as to how the animals graze. So for example, cattle, I talked about not grazing too close. The way that cattle graze with wrapping their tongue around the forage and ripping it off, then that kind of helps them from being able to get too close. So they typically can't go closer than about 2 inches with the way that they graze. Whereas sheep and goats, with a biting action, they can get very close to the ground. And so you have to be more careful with those small ruminants of removing them from that field before they graze right into the ground. With poultry, particularly with chickens, the figures, and I confirmed this with Todd, is typically you figure that about 20% of their diet is coming from the pasture, both the bugs and some of the forage, and 80% from the feed that you're giving. So in a lot of ways, they're not doing a lot of grazing. Their effect on the pasture would be more the trampling action. And if they're left for too long, it would be that buildup of manure that could hinder the growth. Some manure, some litter is very helpful. Too much, it hinders the growth. Their damage to the pasture would also be just that scratching action as they're looking for grubs underneath the soil. So Bob, follow if you want to with what you were thinking with digestive system, but that's how I would answer that.
Question from Caroline. For the Clark farms, I assume that's Todd Clark, were the chickens following after the cattle? Can you discuss managing to avoid overutilization in systems like these? What does Clark's grazing periods look like?
very good question. So I asked Todd specifically that question, and the chickens are following his cattle. He has a rotational grazing system with his cattle, and he's typically moving those to a new area every 3 to 4 days. His goal is to not graze closer than about 3 inches so that there's good regrowth of that forage. But he's also using the cattle going first because he doesn't want excess growth. He found, particularly in the summer months, that if he has too much growth, when he moves the birds onto that area, then I commented earlier, but he can have as much as 0.2 of a pound less gain at the end of the season. He thinks a lot of it is just air movement, and it's harder for the animals to move around inside that cage. So moving them directly after the cattle, then he has that lower growth. The chickens, in his case, he's only leaving on one spot for 1 day. He figures that depending on how many you have in a cage, you may could leave it a couple of days, but that way the chickens are not hurting the pasture. They're helping potentially with parasites, fly larvae, et cetera, in the manure as they pick through that, and then they're moved off of that. So in essence, you've got this grazing period with the cattle. The chickens are coming back on there, not doing a lot of grazing, but also not doing a lot of damage because they're moved frequently, and then the pasture is allowed to grow back. He doesn't put the chickens back on that pasture again for the season, but with the cattle, he would be moving them about once a month back onto the same areas that they grazed. So the chickens go through one time, the cattle go through on that kind of monthly or so grazing period.
I would imagine that for the poultry, that would be parasite control to not have them go through on land that they had been on that same season, would break that cycle.
That's right. And Todd mentioned something to me that I thought was very interesting. So we would typically recommend not to put them back on the same area during that growing season. He found on his operation, and he also does a fair bit of managing for Marksbury, giving advice to other people, that they actually try not to go back on the same pasture with the poultry for several years. That they've seen even the following year, if they go back on the same pasture, the birds do not do quite as well. He couldn't explain that specifically, whether that was some kind of parasite issue or something else. But the other point, when he mentioned that, I thought, well, that's actually makes a lot of sense from a agronomic or forage standpoint, because you get such a benefit with the litter of the birds on the pasture that if you can move them around as much of your farm as possible, then you're going to get those benefits. Obviously, that may be limited by where you're at, by potential predators, et cetera.
A lot of for parasite control, should mention that turkeys should not be raised on pasture that chickens have been on in the last 3 years because of blackhead. I know there's another producer not far from here, Max Stone, and he made the mistake of raising his turkeys on pasture that had the chickens on it, and all of his turkeys broke out in blackhead. So chickens can get it, the parasite that causes blackhead, but they don't show any symptoms. And so then you run the turkeys through and they break with it, and there is no treatment for blackhead. So that's when you're talking poultry, you have to be careful.
Yeah, good. I learned something there, Jackie.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to say is a lot of the grazing of the chickens would depend on what type of chickens. I believe Todd raises the Cornish cross, which is the typical broiler cross, and they're not as good of a forager as a dual purpose breed or the Red Rangers. We ran some through at the poultry farm, and the broilers, they just poop a lot and lay down and flatten everything, whereas the dual purpose birds and the Red Rangers like to eat the forage a little bit more. So a lot of it, the grazing effect will depend on what breed you're using. I'm not sure what types they have in Scotland, if they're using the slower growth ones. Europe is more into slow growth than we are. And it makes, usually if you're raising chickens on pasture, you have to mow it first before they go on. One, it makes it easier to move the tractor, but they can't eat old growth, and that's where the digestive system comes into play, because chickens can't digest high cellulose and lignin. So instead of mowing it, you can have the cattle or whatever go through first and get it down, so that when your chickens come through, you're getting only new growth, which they can digest a little bit better than the old growth. And also the cattle and buffalo, I've seen it with buffalo as well. They have all those big patties that get maggots in it, and when poultry go after it, they spread out all that, those patties, and eat the maggots. And so you're spreading out that fertilizing effect of the ruminants by having poultry go through it afterwards. So that was interesting.
And Jackie, let me follow up, because someone asked there earlier about what sequence of moving. So to have a perfect sequence of cattle first and then the chickens, and they kind of keep up with the growth, that requires a lot of chickens. If you don't have that many, then it would be important. And Todd made this comment, if the pasture gets ahead of him, then he does mow before putting the chickens on it. The important thing though would be you mow it, the chickens go, and then you make sure there's a good regrowth period before grazing again. But as you mentioned, there's several practical reasons, both of the new growth, for moving the tractor, for Todd's comment about even better airflow under the tractors.
Right. What are Clark's farm forage species? They must move the chickens daily on the pasture the cattle have moved off of. Yes, so you said they was moving them daily. I mean, I would imagine as they get older, as Cornish, with the number that he has, he may even have to move it twice a day prior to slaughter.
He keeps moving once a day, but he said during that last week or two, he can get some damage on the pastures, because obviously they're eating a lot more and pooping a lot more. You know, a couple of other things Todd said that are really important to think about. And if you've been raising pasture poultry for a while, you're probably familiar, but his goal is to move the poultry around the whole pasture that he's got the cattle on. But he realized that if he gets in areas that have low spots, then you get a bit of water, not just necessarily water that drowns the animals, but water enough that the birds get wet. Even in the summer, just that extra cooling, he starts losing birds. The other thing, even though he lives near Lexington, so it's not a really heavily wooded area, but if he's close to the fences or close to the fence rows and trees, then he has more predator damage. Even though he puts electric netting around those chicken tractors, still the skunks and possums and raccoons tend to find ways through that. But they're out in the field, then there's less predator damage. So obviously there's practical considerations about where you move through the field and watching those particular spots.
And chickens can handle, quite low temperatures unless they get cold. Unless they get wet. They don't deal with wet very well at all. Heather asks, based on my comments, would it make sense to allow a few days or a week or so for regrowth to start for the chickens to eat, followed by a rest period? Yes, what you just said. Give them you need a little bit of regrowth before you put the birds on.
That's right. And, ideally, but, we're talking just a couple of days. And if you're not grazing too close with the cattle, then you probably don't need to worry so much about waiting as just trying to keep it from getting too tall.
How would goats or sheep fit into that with their grazing habits, combining cattle, sheep, goats, and poultry?
So in my mind, the poultry would still be last.
Okay.
And then with the goats or sheep, it would depend on what plane of nutrition they were in. For example, if you're trying to fatten lambs and you wanted the ideal growth for them, they would probably be the first in the pasture. So they get the pick of anything that's there. And goats in particular, to some extent, sheep are going to look for a range of forages and forbs and weeds. So they get kind of the pick of what's there, those that are in a fast growth stage. Then the cattle come, then the sheep would come. Then the poultry would come. Good friends in Australia that are raising merino sheep, that they're actually to be slow wool growth for that finer wool. Then the sheep are going last. They're getting the less nutritious forage because they don't want the wool growing too fast. But in most cases, the small ruminants would be first, and then the cattle, and then the poultry. But if you had, dry ewes and you had cattle and peak lactation, then it'd be good for them to go first. So kind of keep in mind the level of nutrition that you need. If the pasture was way overgrown, it was low quality forage, then you may need the cattle to go in, that they would have a better chance of utilizing that, even though they wouldn't gain very well, but kind of knocking that down. And then you'd probably go with the small ruminants and the chickens. Good question.
What was I going to ask? It was, I know, it just made me think of something else, but I remember, I don't know enough about ruminants and disease, but I read somewhere that there are some parasites of goats, at least, maybe sheep, that poultry, if you run them after, can break that cycle and therefore prevent some of the parasite in the small ruminants by having poultry. I don't know if it works the other way, because I don't think that the goats affect the poultry, but I do know that you shouldn't run pigs and poultry. There are some diseases that pigs can get from poultry. The other question, and I remembered what my question was, when we ran the chickens on our pasture at the farm, we had alfalfa, and we cut it first and then ran the birds through on the fresh stuff. And when we looked at the regrowth of the pasture that the birds had been on, there was a lot of weed growth, so that the alfalfa pasture was, sort of made poor quality by having the poultry come on. Are they getting that from their feed? It was ground feed, so it doesn't make a lot of sense that they would have weed seeds.
A lot of people suspect or think that it's coming from the feed, and even when poultry houses are cleaned out and the litter's put on fields, that it must be contamination. But most every study I've seen, it's actually just that flush of nutrients that stimulates the weeds. So the weeds that are there can take off and grow great with that excess nitrogen that's there. Plus the fact that the chickens have scratched the ground up. So you'd have weed seeds that are under the soil that aren't germinating because they don't have sunlight, but they've, in essence, the soil's been tilled.
Right.
So in that alfalfa system, having a grass mixture in with the alfalfa to keep there from being as much bare soil would be a way to limit the weed growth.
Right. I was just, the first question about the different digestive systems and the longevity of the pasture. So that, do you have to reseed the pasture after each rotational year, or?
So if you're using good rotation, then the longevity of the pasture is more based on that forage species. So alfalfa is 5 to 6 years in our area. White clover is 3 to 4. Red clover is about 3. Orchard grass is about 4 years. Fescue is five or more. I mentioned perennial ryegrass for us is 2 years, so short term, but in Scotland or Maine or other areas, it would be several years. So look more at the species. But if you're not rotationally grazing or you're leaving them for too long, then it may well be an annual overseeding that you've got to do. I noticed, Jackie, a question popped up about with the legumes, how long after seeding before you start getting the nitrogen? So if you frost seeded now, the clover will be germinating in March. You'll have very small plants. So you're wanting to let those plants get some size. Once they get some size, so we're talking germinating in March, April, May, before you really want to do a lot of grazing. You're not getting a lot of nitrogen. The nitrogen is being used more by the legume in those early stages, not by grass that's next to it. But as you move later in the season, there's a couple of things happening. One, the grazing, whether it's the chickens nipping at the clover or whether it's the cattle, you've got recycling of the nitrogen from the clover through the urine and the manure or through the litter from the poultry going back on the soil. So you've got the nitrogen going that way. The nitrogen from the legume being released to the grass, that happens with the alfalfa and red clover, mainly over winter, where the nodules are sloughing off. But with white clover, you do get a release after each grazing. Some of those nodules come off. But in a grazing system, most of the nitrogen recycling is through the manure in the urine. In a hay system, is kind of a delayed effect before you're getting the benefit of the nitrogen from the legume to the grass.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's a good one to know. Any other questions? Oh, yeah. If chickens don't do well when they get wet, can chickens stay in chicken tractors during rainy weather? If they have good coverage and they're not, if the chickens themselves are not getting wet, it's not a problem. Yeah. I know that when I was in Minnesota, there was a farm and their uneven ground and everything, the birds were getting wet. If the birds are getting wet in pasture, they're gonna die.
Yeah.
And so that was, they couldn't do it because of that.
Yeah. So Todd's comment was just stay off the low ground. And even if there's undulating ground, just some low spots, you just want to skip over that area with the chicken tractor. Because even just, like you say, just a bit of surface water going over the top of the ground, and the birds get wet. If the water leaves 10 minutes later, but they're wet, then that can be very hard. But as you said, Jackie, it's amazing. Even in the backyard birds that we had, all winter long, no matter how cold it was, as long as we gave them water, because the water was frozen, they were fine.
Yeah, chickens won't eat if they can't drink, so they always need. And the other thing is that if poultry are on pasture, because of their digestive system, they need to have grit. So they need small pieces of rock or pebbles. If you don't have it in the field, you need to provide it, because the gizzard can't break up that plant material without the grit. So if you are free ranging poultry, you need to make sure that not only do they have feed and pasture, they need the grit to be able to digest, to mash up the forage
so
material.
Jackie, if they were on very good soils that just had fine soil particles, you need to add the grit. If it was kind of a little bit rocky ground, like some areas in here, then they could get enough just from the natural rock factors.
Because they'll eat it naturally, but if they don't have it, you need to provide it. Managing with the goal of permanent pasture establishment, does it make sense to let certain paddocks grow to maturity and self-seed periodically?
So yes and no would be my answer. So from a practical standpoint, if you've got plenty of land and you can let pastures have a rest period of several months. So in the regions of the US that have cool season forages, which I think most people are at, then letting that rest through maybe early July, so the bluegrass and fescue orchard grass seed out, then that is giving you some free seed. You just need to make sure before you put the poultry on there that you've mowed it down. I caution people some because one disadvantage of letting it grow up to that size, if you've got weeds in that same pasture, then you're getting the weeds seeding out as well. The other thing is that you're losing however many months it is taking from that kind of height that's a foot tall, that's nice and good quality forage, to 2 or 3 feet tall and seeding out. Then you lose that quality. So it makes sense if you've got enough land, but if you're trying to maximize your land area, then in my mind, it's better to purchase the seed and do the seeding. And I should have emphasized this a little bit more. I kind of commented it when I talked about species, but all of us would, most everyone wants long-term permanent pastures. So look carefully at what are the species that have the best survival. In areas of the Southeast, tall fescue has good survival, but can have some toxic effects on ruminants and even potentially on chickens, so we don't know as much. But there's newer varieties of fescue that don't have the toxicity, so you'd want to choose one of those. Move in other areas where bluegrass is very long-lived. It's long-lived in Kentucky, but even longer-lived as we move further north. And as I mentioned earlier, perennial ryegrass is a great option in the Northeast and upper Midwest and other countries.
We're almost out of time, but I just wanted to come. I watched the OAK, which is the Organic Association of Kentucky. They had a presentation for poultry on Friday last week, and they were rotating between a cover crop, poultry, and vegetables. So they were reestablishing the pasture every so often as they rotated through. And there's a study going on at the University of Kentucky with that, where they're doing that 3-crop rotation with poultry. And they've only done it for 1 year so far, but the effect on pasture, soil quality, and nutrition was interesting. They're slowly starting to see some improvement. So if you're trying to take poor quality soils and make them a little bit better, that sort of rotation helps. That's all part of organics.
Yeah. And Jackie, that's a really good point, is that some people would say, I want to plant something and it's there forever. And I mean, that's great. But building the soil and getting multiple benefits, then doing a rotation with your pasture plants every 3 to 5 years, you can, in many ways, build up the soil and the soil health better than just trying to leave one long term, or particularly if you were growing vegetables and things like that. But even if not, the best growth of the cool season pasture grasses is the first 2 or 3 years after planting. So if you want to maximize production, then replanting every several years is going to maximize production. If you want to maximize longevity, then obviously you want to make sure you pick the forages that are going to have the best longevity.
Okay, I think that's all the questions that got asked. It's almost top of the hour again. So thank you, Ray. That was really good. I really learned a lot and got me thinking on some things.
Good.
We do meet every month. Let me see what's coming up for next. The March 1st is best management practices for preparing eggs for sale when you have flocks of less than 3,000, so that you're getting to that stage where you don't want to hand wash anymore, but it gets expensive to buy the equipment. April 5th is repurposing existing structures for poultry production, and then controlling internal parasites, biosecurity. So check out our upcoming webinars, see if there's anything that interests you. We may have to do the biosecurity one a little early now that high path AI has been detected in wild birds in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. So for those keeping backyard flocks in the United States, please follow your biosecurity program so that you do not get, and it's the Asian strain of the H5N1 high path avian influenza. You don't want to get that breaking out in our poultry here. So thank you again, Ray. I really enjoyed the presentation. Thanks for being willing to participate. Thanks for those of you who attended. And hopefully we will see you all next month. As I said, the presentation was recorded and the recording will be posted later today. So thank you all. Everybody have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.